Welcome back to MCB 170, Society and the Brain. This is Lecture 12, which corresponds to Part 2 of Module 6. The title of Module 6 is Social Influence on Sexuality. In Part 1 of Module 6, we focused on the neurobiology of sexuality. In Part 2, I'd like to focus on the social influence. The main driver of the need for social control of sexuality is probably sexual competition. Sexual competition is common among non-human primates, where males especially compete aggressively for access to females. But sexual competition occurs among human primates also, males and females. Throughout the reproductive years, but especially intensely at the onset of reproductive years. Competition between adolescent human beings for sexual partners is not overt, it's not violent, it's indirect, but it can be insidious nevertheless. Male and female heterosexual adolescents who perpetrate indirect, but not direct, same-sex aggression are more likely to have dating opportunities. So the indirect aggression is giving certain adolescents greater access to the opposite sex. Females but not males who experience same-sex victimization are likely to have a later onset of dating. Males with high perceived mate value are more likely to use same-sex aggression to maintain their status. And females with high perceived mate value are less likely to experience victimization. So, perceived mate value is valuable indeed. It can give you dating opportunities and protect you from victimization by your peers. Mate value or perceived mate value seems to be determined at the group level, but it is internalized by individuals and affects individual behavior. Male and female teenagers who perceive themselves as having high mate value show more dating desire toward attractive mating partners than those who perceive themselves as having low mate value. So again, perceived mate value appears to be determined at the group level, but it is internalized by individuals and it can affect individual behavior in a profound way during adolescence and beyond adolescence. Probably the most common form of social control of sexuality is the institution of marriage. It's probably older than recorded history and probably developed out of primeval habits. In almost all societies, access to women is regulated in some way to moderate the intensity of the competition among men for them. So marriage serves this role. It determines which women belong to which men, and if that's respected by the group, then that decreases the competition between men for women. The most common forms of marriage are monogamy and polygamy. In monogamy, you have one man married to one woman. In polygamy, one man can be married to more than one woman. In the world today, more countries, the majority of countries, permit polygamy. Polygamy is legal in the majority of countries in the world today. In practice, most marriages are monogamous, even in countries that allow polygamy. So monogamy, one man and one woman married together, is the most common form of marriage in the world today. But marriage isn't the only way that society controls sexual behavior. This list is from Ross and Rapp. This is a really, really interesting article, which is your reading for the week. They identify at least 3 levels of social control of sexuality at the family, the community, and national or world system level. At the family level, we have rules about permissible sexual and marriage partners, guidelines defining incest prohibitions. Incest, of course, is sex between siblings. Customs concerning procreation partners, and the age and state in which marriage is permissible. At the community level, we have courting and behavior customs, transmission of sexual knowledge and opinion, whether in the family, the peer group, or at school. Again, permissible or impermissible sexual partners, and the structure of marriage within the community. On the national and world system level, world systems would include religions that are transnational, and really economic activity, which has become globalized and transnational. It includes religious obligations to spouse and family, legal definitions of paternity, marriage laws, laws concerning prostitution and homosexuality, and economic conditions affecting livelihood. The influence of society at all these levels, from the family to the community to the nation, can influence the individual. And not only the conscious thoughts of the individual, but also their innate urges. These different levels of social control can affect our controlled processes and our automatic processes. According to Ross and Rapp, factors associated with the social influence on sexuality are internalized at the most intimate level of sexual fantasies and feelings and become part of human personality itself. As we mentioned before, marriage and rules about who marries whom are very old. They preceded law and they preceded organized religion. And here's a really interesting description of how the group together determined who would marry whom in many different parts of Scandinavia. This is very interesting to read. These kinds of practices, cultural practices, ancient practices, were pretty effective at determining who married whom and in buy-in of the community. Everyone kind of agreed about who should be married to whom, and then those marriages were not violated by the rest of the community. Still, these practices were deemed immoral by church leaders and middle-class lay observers alike. So both church and state decided that these kinds of practices were wrong and discouraged them. But the loss of such peer regulation seems to be one of the factors leading to increased illegitimacy rates. Probably the social institution that has had the strongest influence on sexuality in the Western world has been the Catholic Church. In the West, the Roman Catholic Church exerted a very strong influence on sexuality. It tightened the connections between sex and marriage, beginning with the idea that cohabitation made marriage official, then witnesses to marriage were required, then the presence of a priest at a public ceremony in a church was required. The Catholic Church also proscribed homosexuality. Actually, the proscription of homosexuality predates the Catholic Church. In the Western world, the proscription against homosexuality really was initiated by the Hebrews. They were the first religion to forbid homosexuality as part of their canon. But it went from the Hebrews to the Catholics to the Protestants, and the prohibition against homosexuality has been around for many centuries, millennia even. And it's only in recent decades that society has begun to open up and permit homosexuality again. So we know that human beings can vary in their sexual orientation. What about animals? Is there such a thing as animal homosexuality? There absolutely is. There's a tremendous literature documenting homosexuality among animals, especially among the higher animals, the birds and the mammals. There's a very excellent book I can recommend. If you're interested, just email me and I'll send you the reference. Yes, homosexuality exists among many different kinds of animals. And on that level, we could say that it's natural. And because there's homosexuality in animals, it has allowed us to explore neurobiologically the possible basis of sexual orientation. The most famous study of sexual orientation in animals was done in sheep. In sheep, the females, or ewes, mate only with males. A male sheep is a ram. So among domesticated sheep, the females apparently are all heterosexual. But the rams either mate exclusively with ewes, they're heterosexual, they're called female-oriented rams, fours, they're the heterosexual ones, or with other rams, male-oriented rams, or moors, the homosexual male sheep. And studies have shown that the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area is 2 to 3 times larger in the heterosexual than in the homosexual sheep or in the ewes. Remember that the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area, the SDN-POA, or just SDN for short, is one of the main sexually dimorphic nuclei in rats. Apparently, the SDN-POA is also sexually dimorphic in sheep. And again, the ewes and the homosexual rams have a smaller SDN than the heterosexual rams. This difference in SDN volume is present in late gestational fetuses and is due to differing levels of gestational testosterone. So the sexual dimorphism is established during gestation. Gestation is the period from conception to birth. It's established during gestation, and it's present in sheep when they are born. These experimenters found that the differences in the sizes of the SDNs in adult ewes, fours, and moors are not reduced by gonadectomy followed by prolonged treatment to equalize their testosterone levels. I'll show you some data on that in a minute. What they're basically saying is that the size of the SDN is determined at birth by sex hormones that influence development during gestation. After the animal is born, testosterone cannot change the size of the SDN. So in this experiment, they took adult female ewes, female-oriented rams, fours, and male-oriented rams, moors. Again, the fours are heterosexual males, the moors are homosexual males. And they were gonadectomized and then artificially supplemented with testosterone to bring them all up to roughly the same level. Okay? Recall that the gonads, the ovaries in females and the testes in males, produce the sex hormones. Males and females, the ovaries and the testes, produce all 3 sex hormones: testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. In this case, what they did is they gonadectomized the animals. They took out their ovaries or testes, which reduced their sex steroid production almost to nothing. Recall that the adrenals do produce a small amount of the sex hormones, but most of the sex hormones are produced by the gonads. They remove the gonads, bringing all the animals' sex hormone levels to very low levels, not zero, but very low levels, and then they supplemented them all with high levels of testosterone to bring them all up to the same level, which was about the same level as female-oriented rams or the heterosexual rams. And so here you can see that this experimental manipulation worked. They all have roughly the same level of testosterone now in these adult sheep. And after a period of about a year with this testosterone treatment, they then looked at the size of the SDN in these animals. And what did they find? Well, they found that the ewes, the females, still had a small SDN. The fours, the heterosexual males, still had a big SDN. And the homosexual males, the homosexual rams or the moors, had a lower, smaller SDN size, still in the heterosexual males. So the year of treatment with testosterone at a high level did not change the size of the SDN. The conclusion is the SDN-POA size is determined by sex hormones during the fetal critical period is not altered by subsequent testosterone manipulation. So what do we conclude from this? Well, the main conclusion is that the size of the SDN is determined at birth. It can't be changed by adult testosterone level. In other words, you can't make a homosexual ram into a heterosexual ram by giving him a lot of testosterone. We could speculate beyond that, and we could say that in sheep, the size of the SDN determines sexual orientation, at least in the rams. A ram with a big SDN will be heterosexual, a ram with a small SDN will be homosexual. Is such a thing true for humans? Does the size of a particular brain region determine sexual orientation in human beings? Well, where would we look for such a region? This interesting experiment gives us a clue. These experimenters did MRI on subjects, both structural and functional MRI. Structural MRI shows you the structure of the brain. Functional MRI shows you which parts of the brain are active. And they put people in an MRI scanner and they showed them erotic film clips. This study was not done in America, it was done in Europe, and these erotic film clips were apparently really erotic, very arousing. What parts of the brain became active? Viewing erotic film segments produces sexual arousal in men and women and activates the prefrontal, orbitofrontal, orbitotemporal, insular, and cingulate cortices, as well as the amygdala and ventral striatum in both sexes, in both males and females, in both men and women, looking at very erotic X-rated movies. All of these regions in the brain are activated. They include prefrontal cortex and orbital frontal cortex. Those are the main regions of our controlled processes. They're toward the highest levels of our brains. They're active during viewing erotic video clips. The insula is active, it's associated with disgust. Anterior cingulate cortex is activated, it's associated with conflict. Amygdala is activated, it's associated with fear. Finally, we get to the ventral striatum, which is associated with pleasure. So what do we have here? Fear and disgust mixed with pleasure, conflict and reason and control of emotion, all bundled into one response. This experiment shows us very clearly that many parts of the brain are involved in the control of sexual activity in human beings. Here's another interesting finding. The erotic film viewing activates parts of thalamus and hypothalamus in men only. So there are parts of hypothalamus that are only active in men, not in women, when viewing erotic video clips. If we're looking for a place that would determine sexual orientation or differences in sexual orientation, we might look in the hypothalamus of human beings too. So here's a diagram showing kind of the map of the, oops, sorry about that. My touchpad is too sensitive. This is a diagram showing the layout of the human hypothalamus. This is the pituitary stalk down here. Pituitary hangs off the bottom of the brain. Right below the brain runs the optic tract. Human beings have big eyes with big nerve bundles going from our eyes back into our brains. We'll talk about that in a later lecture in the course. These big fiber tracts, these big optic nerves, run right under our brain, and you can see them here. They're shown here in cross-section through these optic tracts. They're a good landmark in the hypothalamus. Right, and the optic tract crosses, the two big bundles of optic nerves cross at a place called the optic chiasm. And there's these are all hypothalamic nuclei, all these little bunches of neurons here. The suprachiasmatic nucleus sits right on top of the optic chiasm. It'll become important later. The supraoptic nucleus is also an important landmark for us. The supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus are important landmarks for us because they make oxytocin and vasopressin, and we talked about those a lot in Module 5. So here you can see the location of the optic chiasm, the optic tract, Superoptic nucleus, paraventricular nucleus. Again, here, superoptic nucleus, paraventricular nucleus. Humans don't really have an SDN-POA. They don't really have an analog necessarily. They don't really have exactly the same SDN-POA, which is larger in male rats and male sheep than in female rats and female sheep and in homosexual sheep. We don't have exactly that structure. But I call your attention to this place kind of right about here in relation to the paraventricular and superoptic nucleus, because in that region, there are these little nuclei that might kind of be analogous to the SDN-POA. It's called the interstitial nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus, which occurs in humans. Okay, and so in this little diagram here, we have the optic chiasm, we have the superoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus, and in this region right about here, we have these four little nuclei, little subnuclei, sort of subnuclei, tiny little things. And this is a very famous experiment done by Simon LeVay, who is a very gifted neuroanatomist who became a gay rights activist during the AIDS crisis. Interesting person. Here he's showing a micrograph of INAH3. There's four of these interstitial nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus, and he's showing the third one, okay, in B, in a heterosexual man, and in C, in a homosexual man. Notice, INAH3, the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, is markedly bigger in the straight man than in the gay man. So here's some data. Here he's showing the volumes of INAH1, 2, 3, and 4 in females on the left in each plot, heterosexual males in the middle on each plot, and homosexual males on the right in each plot. What do we notice? What strikes us right away? What strikes me right away is that these vary a lot. But if you look closely, you'll see that on average, INAH3 is bigger in heterosexual males than in females or in homosexual males. So Simon LeVay concluded that the size of INAH3 can determine sexual orientation in human beings. This finding was amazing to the neuroscientific community. It took the neuroscientific community by storm. It was the first time that anyone could point to a specific little tiny brain region that possibly could determine human sexual orientation. But there were problems with this study. The first is the high variability in really the sizes of all these places, but particularly in INAH3. Look how much the size of the INAH3 varies in heterosexual males, pretty much over the whole range. Another problem that concerns the source of the human brain tissue that LeVay used in his study. These symbols mark individuals who died of different causes. The filled circles are individuals who died of AIDS. The one open circle is a bisexual who died of AIDS. And the triangles are individuals who died of other causes, not AIDS. Notice that most of the heterosexual males did not die of AIDS. Some did. They were probably drug addicts who used infected needles. So there were some heterosexual males in the sample, only a few homosexual, that were mostly heterosexual males. Most of the heterosexual males died of causes other than AIDS. A few died of AIDS. They were probably drug abusers. Among the homosexual males, all of them had died of AIDS. So that's a confounding factor. It could be that AIDS, rather than sexual orientation, was the correlate of the size of the INAH3. Later on, scientists tried to replicate LeVay's study. Just to summarize, the interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus in humans is thought to be homologous to the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area, SDN-POA in rats and in sheep. It's not the same, but it might be kind of related. As we said, the INAH3 has 4 subnuclei, INAH 1, 2, 3, and 4, and LeVay, as we showed in the previous slide, found that on average, INAH3 is larger in heterosexual men than in women or in homosexual men. Scientists tried to confirm this finding, but they could not. In this study, they restricted the comparison to heterosexuals and homosexuals who had all died of AIDS, so they removed that confound. When they took AIDS out of the equation, because they were comparing only people who had died of AIDS, they found no difference between heterosexual and homosexual men in the size of the INAH3. But they did find one nucleus that was different. This study found that the suprachiasmatic nucleus was twice as large in homosexual than in heterosexual men. So the size difference gets reversed. Homosexual men have a big suprachiasmatic nucleus compared to heterosexual men in this study. The SCN is the named nucleus of the circadian clock, but it may also play a reproductive role. They also found some evidence that the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, which we mentioned before, which is another hypothalamic nucleus or a nucleus related to the hypothalamic nuclei, is larger in male than in female adults. Okay, so more recent studies found no difference in the size of the INAH3 between straight and gay men. They did find a difference in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, bigger in gay than in straight men. Maybe the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis is different sizes in gay and straight men. I think there's still controversy surrounding the issue of whether the size of certain hypothalamic nuclei can determine human sexual orientation. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it isn't just one nucleus, but several that together determine sexual orientation, or maybe sexual orientation is more complicated than that altogether. So what are we left with? Well, there really are 2 theories for the origin of sexuality. The 2 main points of view on the basis of sexual orientation are the essentialist and the social constructionist views. The essentialist view says sexual orientation is determined by genes, prenatal hormones, and brain structures. That's the one we've been discussing. The social constructionist theory says sexual orientation is a culture-bound notion. There's some evidence for the essentialism hypothesis. The hypothesis that homosexuality or sexual orientation in general is due to genes which determine prenatal hormones and brain structures. The first is it's independent of family variables. Homosexual orientation is independent of family variables. It doesn't matter if you have a submissive father or an overbearing mother or any of that kind of stuff that we used to think was associated with homosexuality. It's independent of that. It emerges before individuals experience homosexual sex. So it emerges from the first sexual feelings that a person might have, and the influence, genetic presumably influence, existed even before puberty. It emerges before society labels individuals as homosexual. So before the individual recognizes their own homosexuality, or before other people recognize it, it was there apparently. So there is some evidence that homosexuality has a genetic component. Then what about twins? If homosexuality has a genetic component, then there should be a high concordance in sexual orientation between twins. So in this study, they're comparing monozygotic, dizygotic, and adoptive siblings. Monozygotic twins come from the same zygote. They have 100% of their genes the same. Dizygotic twins come from separate zygotes, separate fertilized eggs. So they have half their genes in common, just like regular siblings do. Regular siblings have roughly half their genes in common. But dizygotic twins gestate together in the same womb at the same time and have the same environment, more or less, more similar than siblings who were born at different times. Adoptive siblings have no genes in common. They have no genes in common. They have their family in common, but they don't have any genes in common. So what is the concordance in sexual orientation between these kinds of siblings? Well, the brothers of gays are also gay at rates of 52% for monozygotic twins, 22% for dizygotic twins, and only 11% for adoptive brothers. The sisters of lesbians are also lesbian at rates of 48% for monozygotic twins, 16% for dizygotic twins, and only 6% for adoptive sisters. So, yes, clearly the concordance in sexual orientation is highest for the most genetically similar siblings. If you have all your genes in common and you're gay, your brother is going to be gay with probability about 50, with chance 50%. Same for a woman. If she's lesbian, her monozygotic twin is going to have a 50-50 chance of also being lesbian. That's high, but it's not as high as we would expect if sexual orientation was purely genetic. Remember, monozygotic twins have 100% of their genes in common. If sexual orientation was due entirely to genes, then the concordance in sexual orientation would be 100%. It's far from that. Other factors must be involved. What other factors? Well, there's some evidence of a correlation between mental health and sexual orientation, and between childhood maltreatment and sexual orientation. Now, before we get into the data, I want to point out that heterosexuals and non-heterosexuals, gay, lesbian, bi, are alike in that most of them have good mental health and did not experience abuse as children. However, the association between vulnerability to mental illness and to child abuse is higher among non-homosexuals. Non-homosexuals are more likely to experience mental illness and to have been abused as children. Let's look at the data. In the first study, they're looking at neuroticism and psychoticism, which are vulnerabilities to neurosis and psychosis respectively. What's neurosis? Neurosis are mental disorders such as anxiety and depression. What's psychosis? Psychosis are mental disorders more like schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is related to psychosis. Psychosis is a little bit more serious than neurosis. Okay, so let's look at the data. Here we have men on the left, women on the right, and within each larger column, the smaller columns are heteros on the left and gay bi or lesbian bi on the right. Notice, first of all, that the rate of neuroticism, and this is 0 to 12, so 12 would be the highest, 6 is about right in between. So these aren't at the high end of the scale, right, for anybody on average. Note that men have less neuroticism, that is, heterosexual men have less neuroticism than heterosexual women, but heterosexual men have more psychoticism than heterosexual women. What about gay men? Gay men, wow, how'd that happen? Gay men have more neuroticism and more psychoticism than straight men. Similarly, lesbian women have more neuroticism and more psychoticism than straight women. What about childhood maltreatment? It's a similar table, men on the left, women on the right. Within each larger column, the smaller columns are hetero on the left or homo on the right. Look at the last line here. Major physical maltreatment as a child. In heterosexual men and heterosexual women, it's around 10%. In gay and bisexual men, it's more than twice as high. In lesbian and bisexual women, it's more than 3 times as high. These are serious statistics. They seem scary. But these relationships hold up in other studies. You'll notice that this was done in 2011, this one in 2002, but more recent studies find the same results. How could this be? How could there be a correlation in proneness to mental illness and childhood maltreatment and non-heterosexual sexual orientation? Well, there's many theories for it. It is not true that mental illness or child abuse causes homosexuality. It does not. However, there's a correlation. What could account for the correlation? One theory involves a concept called counternormativity, that individuals with some predisposition to mental illness, a little neuroticism going on, a little psychoticism going on, or individuals who experienced emotional or physical maltreatment as children are a little different from everybody else. They're a little different. They kind of are forced to operate outside the norm. And the norm might be for heterosexual behavior. So if you have an individual who has some same-sex attraction, some same-sex sexual feelings, and they're already used to living outside the norm, and same-sex sexual orientation is also outside the norm, those people who are already outside the norm might be more willing and more able to take up a same-sex orientation. So individuals with neuroticism, psychoticism, or who have experienced childhood maltreatment are already outside the norm. If they also have same-sex attractions, which are also outside the norm, it might feel more natural for them to act on those feelings and to adopt a same-sex orientation lifestyle. That's probably the best theory that can explain this correlation. Again, it's a correlation. It's not a causal relationship. But we're still left with this idea that genes and environment both determine sexual orientation. Genes and environment pretty much determine everything. How can genes and environment work together to determine human sexual orientation? Well, here's an interesting theory by Bem. It's called the exotic becomes erotic hypothesis. And here's what he thinks happens. Start out with biological variables, your genes, which determine your prenatal hormones and your brain structures. This determines your childhood temperament, whether you're more aggressive or more passive, more active or more quiet, more assertive or more submissive. This in turn leads to typical or atypical activity and playmate preferences. So boys who are aggressive and like rough games will associate with other boys who are aggressive and like rough games. And girls who are more calm and quiet and like to play with dolls will associate with other girls who are calm and quiet and like to play with dolls. What about kids who have sex atypical interests? What about boys who are calm and quiet and would prefer to play with dolls and play football? They might associate with girls. What about girls who are really, really active and want to play sports? They might tend to associate more with boys. Because they're associating with the opposite sex, they might feel different from people of their same sex. The idea here is that if you have sex typical preferences and your peer group when you grow up when you're a little kid are of your same sex, like a whole pack of boys, when you reach puberty, the girls are going to seem interesting all of a sudden. You're going to have sexual feelings and you're going to be attracted to the girls. You're going to have sexual feelings, non-specific arousal, right? Due to the onset of your sexual feelings, your pubertal hormone surge, you're going to feel sexual all of a sudden, and you're going to be attracted to the opposite orientation, people who are different from you, going to be exotic and different and therefore attractive to you. If your peer group was all boys and you reach puberty, you're going to find the girls awfully attractive. If your peer group was all girls, you're going to find the boys sexually attractive. And if you're a boy whose peer group was primarily boys, according to this theory, you'll end up with a heterosexual orientation. But if you're a boy who associated with girls, and the boys seem interesting and exotic, and you're attracted to them, according to this theory, you'll turn out to be gay, and vice versa for girls. What's the evidence for this? Well, here they interviewed many, many individuals, men and women, heterosexual or gay or lesbian, and they asked them various questions like whether or not they had enjoyed sex-typical activities, or whether they had not enjoyed sex-typical activities. So these are the rates at which these subjects did not enjoy sex-typical activities. So gay men who didn't want to play football, gay women who didn't want to play with dolls, and they looked at they correlated that among gays and lesbians and heterosexuals, and they found that among the heterosexuals, only about 10% of the heterosexuals enjoyed not non-typical activities as children, but more than 60% of the gays and lesbians did not enjoy sex-typical activities as children. So more than 60% of the gays and lesbians probably identified and associated more with the opposite sex as playmates as children, and were attracted to individuals of the same sex when they reached sexual maturity, when they reached puberty. This is pretty strong evidence. Recall that the concordance of same-sex orientation among monozygotic twins, which have 100% of their genes in common, is only about 50%. Here we see the concordance between sex atypical activities and same-sex orientation is up at over 60%. It seems like kind of a theory that rests on many assumptions, but it's a better predictor of sexual orientation than genes are. That's significant. But this theory has also come under attack. It's not universally accepted. What else could it be? What else could it be? Well, here's a very, very interesting study. This is an experiment by Zeitch, a sex researcher in Australia. And he interviewed over 4,000 people, over 4,000 adults. And he asked them how many sex partners they had had. And he also asked them how sex typical they were. So if you're a sex typical male, stereotypically, you'll be aggressive and active and assertive and all that stuff. And if you're a sex typical female, you'll be more understanding and compassionate. I know those are stereotypes, but let's go with them for now. And on this axis, he's plotting sex typical gender identity. Well, it's the reverse, sex atypical gender identity. So the more atypical you are, if you're a male with more feminine characteristics, you're going to be, or a female with more masculine characteristics, you're going to be further along the x-axis. So out here we have males and females who are sex atypical. They have more opposite sex characteristics. The most typical are down at the low end of this scale. And this axis, the y-axis, is number of lifetime sexual partners. And the solid curves down here are for the full sample. The squares are the men, the triangles are the women, and this is the number of sexual partners they've had here, and this is how sex typical they were. And this combines gays, lesbians, bisexuals with heterosexuals. Notice this is the number of opposite sex sexual partners. So since this population includes non-heterosexuals, the average number of opposite sex partners is lower. But still, even among folks who have a primarily same-sex orientation, the ones with more sex atypical traits actually had more heterosexual partners. The graph is even clearer when you take out the non-heterosexuals. So up here in A, the dashed lines, you have men and women who are straight. They took out the gays, lesbians, and bisexuals. Now the number of opposite sex partners goes up because these are all heterosexuals. But again, what you find is that even among the heterosexuals, the ones who have more sex atypical traits, like men who can be understanding and women who can be assertive, actually had more opposite sex partners. This leads to the theory that there's a bunch of genes that code for traits that kind of determine our sexual characteristics, who we're attracted to, whether we're assertive or passive, whether we're active or calm. And according to this theory, these different genes, these different traits are kind of distributed more or less randomly among people. And it turns out that males who have all those traits really masculine and females who have all those traits really feminine are rare. Also, males who have all those traits feminine and females who have all those traits masculine are also fairly rare. In fact, according to this theory, if there's about 6 traits and you have to have all 6 sex atypical to be homosexual, then it would predict that there'd be about 5 or 10% of people would be homosexual, which is about the percentage that we actually see in populations. The theory also says that most of us, the majority of us, male and female, gay or straight, combine attributes of both sexes in our personhood. And not only that, but that individuals, including especially heterosexual individuals, who tend to combine sex atypical traits, men who have some female qualities and females who have some male qualities, tend to actually have more heterosexual partners than people who are more sex typical. This theory is very interesting, and it can explain the persistence of homosexuality in populations, not only among human beings, but also among animals, because people of one sex who have opposite sex characteristics are very successful at reproducing, and they keep those kinds of traits, that is, traits for opposite sex characteristics in the same sex, alive in the population. But what it comes down to is that nobody really knows the reason for human homosexuality. It remains for now a mystery. I'll end there.